My name is Caroline Brennan, and I was 36 the year my own family showed me exactly what they believed a life was worth. I was standing in the cemetery with my boots sinking into the wet grass, two freshly turned plots laid out in front of me, when my phone began to buzz inside my coat. My husband Eli was in one of those graves. My daughter Ruby was 6 years old. She was in the other. My parents and my brother hadn't even bothered to come to the burial. They called it a trivial event, not worth attending, and then they boarded a plane to Hawaii together the very next morning. 5 days after I put my whole world into the ground, my mother called me. Not to grieve, to ask for money. And what she said after that is the reason I will never again call her my mother. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories, the place where ordinary women run into impossible families and answer them not with noise, but with quiet, steady strength. If a story here has ever made you feel a little less alone, then you found the right channel. So pour yourself something warm, pull up a chair, leave a comment, and make sure you subscribe because this one begins on the worst week of my life and ends somewhere I never thought it could go. These days, I'm awake by 4 in the morning. The house sits dark behind me when I cross the gravel, and I've stopped flipping on the kitchen light because there's nobody left in there to see it burning. The first thing my hand finds every morning is cold metal, my rig keys. They warm up in my palm by the time I reach the lot, and the cab smells like diesel and yesterday's coffee. For about 20 minutes, in the gray before sunrise, that smell is the only thing in the world that still feels like mine. I drove long haul for 11 years before any of this happened. Men at the truck stops always assumed the owner had to be my husband, and for a long time I just let them think it, because it was simpler than setting them straight. Eli thought that was the funniest thing on earth. He'd order a slice of pie and sit back to watch some dispatcher try to hand me a clipboard meant for the boss, and he'd grin and wait for the exact second the man realized the boss was the woman with grease worked into her knuckles. I still keep his coffee mug in the cab. I never drink out of it. I just like knowing it's riding shotgun, the way he used to. People imagine grief is loud. Mostly, it's 1,000 small things. The moments you reach out for someone and your hand closes around empty air. By the cabin door, there are still 2 little rubber boots, bright yellow, lined up exactly where Ruby kicked them off. I haven't been able to move them. I keep telling myself I will. And then another 4 o'clock arrives, and I don't. 11 months ago, I still had a family waiting for me to come home. I want to tell you how I lost them. But before I can do that, I have to tell you how the people who shared my blood decided they had somewhere more important to be. It rained for 3 straight days that spring, the kind of rain that turns a quiet creek into a moving wall of water in 20 minutes flat. I was 500 miles east on a refrigerated run, hauling produce I can't even remember now, when my phone lit up at a fuel island in Ohio. Eli had picked Ruby up early from her grandmother's because of the weather. He was a careful man, 20 years behind the wheel, never once a ticket. The type who eased off for a yellow light even when the truck on his bumper leaned on the horn. He chose the county road home because the highway was already flooding. There's a low-water crossing out past the old Mercer farm, just a shallow dip of concrete where the creek slips under the road. On any dry day, you'd never give it a second thought. That day, the water rose up over the crossing while they were still on it. They found his truck a quarter-mile downstream, pinned against the cottonwoods. It was 2 more days before the water dropped enough to reach it. I'm not going to tell you the rest. Some things aren't for telling, and Ruby was 6, and she deserves better than to be the saddest line in someone's story. What I will tell you is that I drove home in 9 hours flat, no sleep, both hands trembling on the wheel, running the math the entire way. If I'd turned that load down, If I'd been home to drive them myself. If I'd taught Eli to fear that crossing the way I always had. I rolled back into a town that already knew before I did. Casseroles stacked on my porch, the sheriff's truck parked in my drive. I'd crossed 4 states in 9 hours. I was still 9 hours too late. And the very first call I made, before I could even force the words out of my mouth, was to my mother. Out of everyone alive, I believed she would come. My mother's first question was whether the funeral could be pushed back 2 weeks. I remember sitting down hard on the kitchen floor with the phone pressed to my ear, certain I'd misheard her. She and my father had a trip booked, she explained, Hawaii, 8 days, going with my brother Wade and his wife Vanessa and the grandkids. It had been on the calendar since January. The deposits were already paid. I told her my husband and my daughter were dead. She acknowledged it in the same tone you'd use with a coworker who'd blown a deadline. Then Vanessa took over the family group chat, because Vanessa always takes over. She typed out that everyone was just so terribly sorry, but the tickets were non-refundable, and the children had been counting on this for months, and surely I wouldn't want them to scrap the whole vacation over. And here's the phrase she actually put in writing for all of us to read. A trivial event not worth attending. I read that line 4 separate times. A trivial event. My daughter's funeral. My mother's reply came 2 minutes later. A thumbs up and a single word. Agreed. Not one of them asked how Ruby died. Not one asked for Eli's middle name to put on the headstone, or whether I was eating, or whether I was sitting alone in that house with 2 little yellow boots by the door. They asked which week worked better for their schedules, so I stopped asking. I told them the burial would be Saturday and they were welcome to come or not. Then I hung up and I didn't call again. That was the first moment in my whole life that I understood something cold and clear about the people who raised me. They were never going to choose me. They had never once, in 36 years, chosen me. And the strange part was that knowing it didn't shatter me. It freed up my hands for what came next. The front pew is always reserved for family. At Eli and Ruby's service, that front pew sat empty, so I made the choice to sit in the second row alongside everyone else because the people in the second row had actually shown up. My Uncle Walt drove 4 hours from Joplin and stood beside me the entire time with his hand on my shoulder, steady as a man bracing a fence post against a storm. The church filled. Eli's dispatchers came straight from the yard in their work shirts. The ladies from the diner came. Ruby's kindergarten teacher came and wept harder than I did. And the whole soccer team showed up in their little blue jerseys because Eli had coached them every Saturday morning. My parents were on a beach, my brother was on a beach. Their seats stayed empty and pristine while 100 working people pressed in shoulder to shoulder to say goodbye to a truck driver and a little girl. I gave the eulogy myself. I didn't trust my voice in anyone else's hands. I said Eli slowed down for yellow lights. I said Ruby drew trucks instead of princesses. I said they were the best thing I ever built, and the only thing I couldn't manage to keep. I never once mentioned the empty pew, and I didn't have to. Every soul in that room could already see it. Afterward, Walt walked me to my car and said the only honest thing anyone in my family managed all month. Caroline, they're not coming back to you. Not really. You ought to build your life like that's already true. I buried my husband and my daughter alongside the people who actually came. And as I stood there between the 2 fresh plots, gravel shifting under my boots, the phone in my coat started to buzz. My mother's name, calling from Honolulu. I let it ring out into the wet grass, and I had no idea yet what she was about to ask me for. 5 days later, she finally caught me on the phone because I answered out of pure exhaustion. There was no, "How are you?" There was no, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." There was wind and an airport boarding announcement in the background, and my mother's voice going straight to business like a woman calling about an overdue invoice. "Caroline, we need to talk about the money." I sat down. I asked, "What money?" She said, "The $40,000. Her tone made it clear I was supposed to already know. Then she told me Wade's dealership was in trouble, that the family needed to pull together now, that I had to understand the bigger picture here. And when I didn't answer fast enough, she delivered the line I'll be hearing in my sleep for the rest of my life. "We can always make more money, Caroline. We can't make more family." She said that to me, to the daughter whose family was lying in the ground precisely because they wouldn't fly home. She said it from the Honolulu airport, sand probably still in her sandals, asking me for $40,000 to bail out the son who'd been stretched out on a beach while my little girl was lowered into the earth. I held the phone away from my face and looked at the 2 pairs of yellow boots by the door. I thought about how a person can take the most beautiful word in the language, family, and use it like a crowbar to pry money out of someone they just abandoned. I came very close to laughing and very close to something much worse. Instead, I asked her one quiet question. "What $40,000 do you think is yours?" There was a pause on the line. The particular kind of pause that tells you someone has already decided what they're owed and simply hasn't said it out loud yet. And in that silence, I began to understand exactly what they believed they were entitled to and exactly how wrong they were. Here's where the $40,000 came from. 4 years earlier, before any of this, I wanted to stop hauling other people's freight and own my own truck. A solid used tractor ran about $90,000. I'd saved most of it the hard way, but I came up short, and Eli and I needed a bank loan to close the gap. The lender looked at my down payment and asked where $40,000 of it had come from, because that's what lenders do. It had come from my parents, years before. They'd handed it to me in front of Wade one Christmas when they were feeling generous and important, and they had called it a gift toward my future. A bank doesn't just take your word for that. When part of a down payment comes from relatives, the lender makes those relatives sign a letter. It's a real, formal document. It states that the money is a true gift, that no repayment is expected, that it is not a loan and never was. I didn't think twice about it back then. I drove the paperwork over to my parents' house myself, sat at their kitchen table, and watched my mother and my father each sign their name to that letter so I could buy my truck. Then I filed it away with my loan documents and forgot it existed, the way you forget a thing you'll never need, right up until the day you need it more than anything you own. My mother had forgotten it too, or maybe she'd just decided it didn't count anymore, because now, 4 years later, with Wade going under and my entire life buried in the cemetery, she had quietly reclassified that gift in her head. It wasn't a gift anymore. Now it was an investment. And an investment, she figured, was the kind of thing a family could demand back whenever it pleased. She had no idea what was sitting in my filing cabinet. Wade called the next day to finish what my mother had started. My brother is 33, and he's spent his whole life being the responsible one, which mostly translated to being the one my parents bankrolled. He'd opened a car dealership a couple of years back with money he didn't really have, and now the floor plan loans were eating him alive, and the lot was full of trucks nobody wanted to buy. He didn't ask about Ruby either. He opened with the dealership, then with the family, and then with the part that told me everything I needed to know. "Look, Callie," he said, "you're alone now. What do you even need it for?" I let that hang in the air. You're alone now. As though my husband and my daughter were a line item they'd been kind enough to zero out for me. As though grief came with a refund. Then Vanessa texted, because Vanessa can't tolerate a silence. She wrote that family money was a shared pool, that I'd taken from the pool once and now it was somebody else's turn, and that frankly, my attitude was hurting everyone. A shared pool. I'd repaid my parents' generosity 100 different ways over the years, but you can't ever repay people who keep dragging the line further away. The worst part wasn't the asking. The worst part came a week later, when a cousin let slip that they'd already been telling the whole extended family their version. That poor Wade was drowning, and selfish Caroline was sitting on her trucks and wouldn't lift a finger to help her own blood. They'd built the entire story before I'd even said no. They just needed me to step into the role of villain. I decided right then that I wasn't going to argue with their story. I was going to outlast it. I'd love to tell you I never wavered. I'd be lying. There's a thing I do, a thing I suspect a lot of you do, where I'd rather shoulder the whole weight myself than make a scene. I've been the one everyone leaned on since I was 9 years old, packing Wade's lunches because our mother was tired. So one night, a week into the calls, I actually sat down with my checkbook. $40,000 would wipe out my cushion completely, but it would make the phone stop ringing. And some bone-tired animal part of me just wanted the noise to end. Walt caught me at it. He'd taken to dropping by, fixing things that weren't broken, sitting in Eli's chair so the room wouldn't feel so empty. He saw the open checkbook on the table and he didn't raise his voice. He just said, "You'd really write that, wouldn't you? You'd pay them to keep skipping your funerals." And I set the pen down, because he was right. I wasn't afraid of being called ungrateful. I was just so used to being the one who fixed everything that I'd nearly fixed the wrong thing entirely. If you've ever been the person everyone leans on and nobody ever catches, stay with me, because this is the exact part where I stopped carrying people who couldn't be bothered to stand at my daughter's grave. Drop a comment if you've ever been that person, and subscribe, because what I did instead of writing that check is the whole reason I'm sitting here telling you this. I capped the pen, closed the book, and the next morning at 4, I did the one thing that has never once let me down. I went to work. Going back to work meant facing every man who assumed I'd fall apart without Eli. The bank officer who held my line of credit asked, in a gentle voice that was somehow worse than rudeness, whether I'd given any thought to selling the equipment while it still held its value. A freight broker I'd worked with for years suddenly developed doubts about whether the outfit could keep running, given everything. I heard secondhand that 2 of them were telling shippers I wouldn't make it through the season, a grieving widow with a couple of trucks. They'd already counted me out. My keys were cold in my hand every single morning, and some mornings that cold was the only thing holding me upright. But I gripped them like they were the last thing on this earth that was actually mine, because they were. Then Diane found me. Diane is pushing 60, ran dispatch for a regional carrier for 30 years, and has forgotten more about freight than those brokers will ever learn. She took me to a truck stop, bought me a plate of eggs, and handed me the only piece of business advice that ever mattered. "Honey," she said, "from here on out, people are either working with you or they're working against you. There is no third chair. Quit hoping the doubters come around. Just make them irrelevant." So that's what I did. I called every shipper who'd ever trusted Eli, and I told them the flat truth. The owner was still the woman with grease under her nails, same as she'd always been, and she was still running on time. I undercut nobody and outworked everybody. And about 3 weeks into that, a contract crossed my desk that was too big for 2 trucks. A regional grocery chain, steady freight, real money. The kind of account that builds an actual company. All I had to do was be brave enough to take it. To take that contract, I needed a second tractor on the road, and fast. So I started clearing out Eli's old rig to sell it and free up the cash. That truck was his heart. He'd kept it spotless, oil logs current to the day, a little plastic horse that Ruby had glued to the dash, so Daddy has a friend. I sat in that cab for a full hour before I could bring myself to touch anything. Then I started pulling out his things, gentle, the way you go through the pockets of a sleeping man, his sunglasses, an old church bulletin, a roll of quarters for the air machine, and down in the door pocket, tucked under a folded map, his logbook. Not the electronic kind the law requires now, the old paper kind he kept anyway out of pure habit. 20 years of his life in pencil, every run, every mile, all of it in his careful block letters. I held it and couldn't make myself open it. It felt like opening his hands. I told myself I'd read it later, when I was stronger, and I set it on the passenger seat next to his coffee mug and the little plastic horse. But I'd noticed something when I picked it up. The last page wasn't a run entry. It was writing. More of it than a log entry would ever need, his handwriting filling the lines. He'd written something there before he died, and I hadn't known, and now it was sitting 2 feet away from me, waiting. I drove home with it on the seat like a passenger. I'll be honest with you, I was afraid of that page. Some part of me already understood that whatever Eli had written on it was going to change what I did next, and I wasn't sure I was ready to be changed. It took me 3 more days to open it. While that logbook sat unopened on my kitchen table, my family went to work on my name. Vanessa ran the whole campaign, because Vanessa treats family like a marketing account. The texts arrived daily, reminders of everything my parents had supposedly done for me, a guilt trip dressed up as concern, asking whether I'd gotten any help for how bitter I'd become. She forwarded me a photo of Wade's kids with a caption about how they might lose their house, as though their house and my dead daughter belonged on the same scale. And she worked the relatives hard. My cousin Paige called and told me what was making the rounds, that I'd come into money and turned my back on the family, that grief had made me cruel, that my parents were heartbroken over my coldness. The same parents who'd been snorkeling while I picked out a child-sized casket. They'd flipped it completely. In their telling, they were the wounded ones, and I was the villain who wouldn't help her struggling brother. For about a day, it made me physically sick, because a lie, repeated by enough mouths, starts to feel like weather, like something you simply have to live underneath. Then it made me clear. They were never going to stop on their own. People who rewrite the story to cast themselves as the victim never volunteer to put the pen down. Paige, to her credit, wasn't buying any of it. "I was at that funeral, Callie," she said. "I saw the empty pew. I'm not crazy." That was the first crack. One person in that family who'd stood in the same room I had and seen the truth of it. I didn't know yet how much I'd come to need her, but I filed it away, right next to the gift letter, right next to the logbook, in the growing folder of things that were going to matter. Paige called again on a Thursday, and her voice was different, lower. The voice people use when they're telling you something they aren't supposed to. "They're planning something," she said, "at the anniversary." My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up, a big party at the church hall, the whole extended family invited. I hadn't planned to go. But Paige had been sitting at my aunt's kitchen table when my mother and Vanessa mapped the whole thing out. They were going to corner me there, in front of everyone. My father, Gordon, was going to stand up during the toasts and make a family appeal, put me on the spot in public, frame it as the prodigal daughter refusing to help her family in their darkest hour. They figured I'd either buckle under the weight of 40 relatives watching or refuse and prove I was exactly the cold woman they'd been describing. Either way, they won. It was a trap with 2 exits, and both of them led right where they wanted me to go. Paige thought I should skip it, stay home, stay safe, don't hand them the stage, and for a minute, that's what I figured I'd do. Then something inside me went very still and very calm, the way it does on a mountain grade when the brakes start to fade and you stop being scared and just start driving. They wanted an audience. 40 people, the whole family, gathered into one room to watch them put me in my place. But the thing about an audience is that it cuts both ways. They were building a stage to humiliate me on. And I started thinking about what else a person could do with a stage, and a room full of witnesses, and a truth nobody had bothered to check. That night, I finally opened the last page of Eli's logbook. I poured a coffee I didn't drink, sat down at the table, turned to the back, and there it was. His block handwriting, dated the week before he died. It wasn't a love letter. Eli was never a love letter man. It was a list. He titled it the way he titled everything, plain and direct. Things we're going to do. Buy our own rig. Paid off. No bank. Get our name on the door, not somebody else's. And then the line that pulled the floor out from under me. Brennan and daughter. So Ruby grows up knowing her mama built something. He'd already written our company name. The company we always talked about and somehow never quite started. He'd already picked it out. Brennan and daughter, for the little girl who drew trucks instead of princesses, so she'd grow up watching her mother run something with her own name on the side of it. I sat there a long while. Then the next morning I reached up to the visor of his cab, where I knew he kept her artwork, and I unclipped the drawing that had been riding there for 2 years. Ruby's crayon picture, 3 lumpy trucks in a row, a stick figure with yellow hair standing beside them, and her careful kindergarten letters underneath. Mama's Trucks. I'd looked at it 100 times and never truly seen it. They'd called her funeral a trivial event. They'd called my whole life a line item, and I was about to make that little girl's name worth more than their entire vacation. I didn't decide it in a rush of anger. I decided it the way you decide to take a long grade in a lower gear, on purpose, with both eyes wide open. The next week, I filed the paperwork. The company stopped being Caroline Brennan, owner-operator. It became Brennan and Daughter Freight. I kept the and daughter. She was gone. And I kept it anyway, because some names you earn by loving someone, not by getting to keep them. Naming the company changed something in how I carried myself. I wasn't grieving and waiting for the storm to blow over anymore. I had a thing to build, a daughter's name on the door, and a room full of people who'd lied about both. I decided I would go to the anniversary party. Not to fight. I've never won anything by being the loudest voice in a room, and I wasn't about to start at my parents' celebration. I'd go for one reason: to set the truth down on the table in front of every witness they'd gathered and let it sit there, where they couldn't text it away or spin it on a phone call. But truth alone had never been enough with that family. They'd been bending it my whole life. I needed something they couldn't argue with, something with their own names on it. And I remembered the gift letter, 4 years filed away, sitting in my cabinet with the loan documents, signed by both of them, swearing in plain language that the $40,000 was a gift and not a loan. The trouble was, I wasn't sure my own copy was still clean and legible, and I knew the original lived inside the bank's loan file. If I was going to lay that page down in front of 40 people, it had to be real, official, undeniable. So I did the unglamorous thing. I called my bank and asked how a borrower goes about getting a certified copy of a document out of her own closed loan file. The woman on the phone said it would take a few days and a small fee. A few days and a small fee. That was the entire price of the thing that was going to turn their faces to paper. I marked the date of the party on my calendar, and I started counting down. Not in dread this time, in readiness. The loan officer who pulled my file was younger than my closing had been, but he found it. I sat across the desk while he flipped through 4-year-old paperwork, and he slid one page across to me, and there they were. My mother's signature, my father's signature. Above them, the language banks use so there's never any doubt. The funds represent a gift. No repayment is expected. This is not a loan in any form. Both of them had signed it at their own kitchen table while I watched. I had the officer make a certified copy, stamped and dated, and I drove it home lying flat on the passenger seat like it might blow away. The whole drive I kept hearing Wade. "You're alone now, Callie." What do you even need it for? I knew now exactly what I needed it for. Not the money. I'd never see that 40,000 and didn't want it. I needed the one page that proved which of us had been telling the truth. And I needed it in front of the people they'd lied to. I wasn't building a case so I could scream. I was building a case so I could stay calm while they didn't. That's the part nobody tells you about getting even the right way. The strongest thing in the room is never the loudest voice. It's the quiet person holding the document. If anyone in your life has ever made you doubt what you plainly remember, here is what 11 years of paperwork taught me. Write it down, keep the page, file the proof. Subscribe, because the next part is the one I waited 11 months for. I slid the certified copy into a plain folder, set it by the door next to my keys, and waited for Saturday. While I waited, the company grew. I took that grocery contract, and to cover it, I bought a second tractor, then leased a third when the freight kept rolling in. I had drivers now, real ones, good ones, men and one woman who'd left bigger outfits because I paid fair and didn't lie. We painted the trucks deep green with the name in clean white letters down both doors, identical on every rig. Brennan and Daughter Freight. And underneath it, small, where you'd only catch it if you were really looking, I had them paint Ruby's 3 lumpy crayon trucks traced exact from her drawing. The first time I saw all 3 rigs lined up in the yard with her artwork on the doors, I had to sit in my truck a while. That broker who doubted I'd survive the season called to ask if I had capacity for his overflow. The bank officer who'd quietly suggested I sell upgraded my credit line without my even asking. Funny how fast she'll never make it turns into, "We always believed in you," once the trucks are moving and the invoice is clear. I didn't gloat. I just remembered. Word of all this traveled the way it does in a small town, and it traveled straight to my family. Suddenly, the daughter who was alone now and didn't need her money was running a real company with her name on 3 trucks. They could smell it. The same people who'd skipped the funeral started liking my posts. My mother sent a single text, the first warm thing in months. "We're so proud of what you've built, honey." So proud of the very thing they tried to pull $40,000 out of. I didn't answer. I just made sure that certified copy was still sitting by the door, and I kept counting down the days. The closer the party got, the louder my mother's version got. She'd given up expecting the check and switched to protecting her story, which mattered to her far more than the money ever had. At the church, at the beauty shop, at her sister's table, she told anyone who'd hold still that Caroline had abandoned the family, that success had gone to her head, that I'd let one tragedy, her word, one tragedy, turn me bitter against my own blood. And she kept reaching for that same line, the one she'd used to ask for the money, except now she aimed it straight at me. "We can't make more family," she'd say, shaking her head all sorrowful, as if I were the one who'd flown to Hawaii, as if I'd been the one to call a child's funeral a trivial event. She'd weaponized the most beautiful word she knew and turned it around until I was the villain holding it. I heard all of this from Paige, who'd appointed herself my spy and my friend in the same breath. And Paige did something I'll never forget. She started quietly telling people the truth, not arguing, not making scenes. Whenever someone repeated my mother's version at the grocery store, Paige would say, mild as milk, "That's strange, because I was at the funeral, and Sharon and Gordon weren't. They were in Hawaii. I've got the dates." And she did have the dates. People began doing the math. A few of them went quiet about it, the way you do when a story you've been repeating turns out to be the exact opposite of the truth. The ground was shifting under my mother's feet, and she couldn't even feel it yet. She thought she was walking into her own anniversary party to put her daughter in her place. She had no idea the place had already moved. The thing that really cracked it open was a photograph. My mother, like a lot of people her age, had discovered that she loved posting pictures online and hated understanding how the timestamps worked. Somewhere in her feed from that spring was a sunlit shot of the whole crew of them, leis around their necks, mai tais in hand, my brother's kids grinning out in the surf. The caption was about making memories. The timestamp was the day after Eli and Ruby went into the ground. Paige found it. She didn't even have to say anything cruel. She just set that photo next to the funeral date, both of them plain as day, and let people look. A leaves and cocktails beach photo, dated the morning after a 6-year-old's burial. You can spin a lot of things with a phone call. You cannot spin a timestamp. The relatives who'd been nodding along to my mother's story now held a date in one hand and a date in the other, and the gap between them was an ocean and a child's grave. Some of them came to me, awkward and sorry, saying they hadn't known, saying my mother had told them I never even invited them, which was its own lie. I didn't rub anyone's face in it. I just said, gently, that the funeral had been open to everyone who wanted to come, and that I'd been grateful for the ones who did. Cool and even. Save the heat for people who deserve to feel it. Because that photo had done in one timestamp what 100 angry words of mine never could have. It had turned the witnesses my parents were gathering into witnesses for me. And the party was 4 days out. 4 days out, I did something I hadn't been able to make myself do in 11 months. I drove out to the lake. Not the crossing, I'll never go back to the crossing, but the lake upstream, where Eli used to take Ruby to skip rocks on Sunday mornings while I caught up on sleep. I went at dawn because that's when the water turns flat and silver and still, no wind, like a held breath. I'd been avoiding it the way you avoid a sore tooth, certain that standing there would break me clean in half. It didn't. I sat on the bank with my coffee, the real cup, not Eli's, and I talked to them a while. I told Ruby about the trucks with her drawing on the doors. I told Eli I'd finally named the company. I told them what I was about to do, and I asked them out loud whether I was doing it for the right reason. And sitting there in the quiet, I got my answer. I didn't want my parents ruined. I didn't want Wade's kids to lose their house. I'm not built to take pleasure in other people's wreckage, even theirs. What I wanted was simpler and harder. I wanted it on the record. I wanted 40 people to know what was true, so that the next time my mother called my daughter's death a trivial event, there'd be a room full of folks who knew better. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to stop being optional. Turns out, for people like my family, those two things feel exactly the same. And I'd stopped being responsible for how the truth made them feel. The water stayed flat and silver. For the first time, standing there didn't break me. It set me level. The night before the party, Walt came by. He'd heard what was coming, the way everyone in a family eventually hears everything, and he offered to stand up with me, to be in the room, to back me, to make sure I wasn't facing all of them alone. It was a good and loving offer, and I told him no. Not because I didn't want him there, but because I'd finally understood that I didn't need a shield. A shield is for someone who's about to lose. I wasn't going in to lose. I was going in with the truth and one certified page and the calmest hands I'd had in a year. Walt, I said, if I bring a bodyguard, it looks like a fight. I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to tell 40 people something true, and then I'm going to leave. He looked at me a long moment. Then he nodded the way he had at the funeral, like a man who knows when to brace the fence post and when to let it stand on its own. Your daddy never had your spine, he said. Neither did your brother. I took that as the compliment it was. After he left, I laid out my clothes for the next day, plain and dark, nothing fancy, because I wasn't dressing to win anybody over. I put the certified copy of the gift letter into my coat pocket, one folded page, and I set the coat by the door. 40 years of marriage, $40,000 they wanted back, and I was bringing exactly one page to the party. I slept better that night than I had since the funeral. When you finally know what you're going to do, the fear has nowhere left to live. The church hall smelled like coffee and carnations and 40 years of potluck. They'd done it up nice, a long table draped in white cloth, a sheet cake with my parents' wedding photo printed across it in sugar, a banner reading 40 years in gold letters, and about 40 relatives, a number I noted with some grim amusement. 40 years. $40,000. 40 people to watch. My mother saw me walk in and her face did a complicated thing. Surprise and triumph at the same time, because she hadn't been certain I'd come, and now that I had, she believed I'd walked straight into her trap. Vanessa air-kissed me. Wade wouldn't meet my eyes. I got handed a paper plate of cake I didn't eat, and I waited because I knew what was coming. A strange calm settles over you when you're the only person in the room who knows the script. They got through the toasts, then my father stood up, tapped his fork against his glass, and the room went quiet for him, and I watched him decide to do it in front of everyone. He thanked them all for coming. He talked about family, about sticking together, about how times got hard and family was supposed to step up. And then he turned, slow and deliberate, toward me. Some of us, he said, have been blessed and have forgotten where the blessing came from. We helped Caroline when she had nothing, $40,000. And now that she's done well, she won't lift a finger for her own brother. A murmur ran through the hall. Vanessa, right on cue, added her line, sweet as poison, pitched just loud enough. It's a shame. We even missed that funeral for family, and this is the thanks. A trivial event. She'd actually called it that again in different words in front of everyone. The room turned to look at me. My mother sat with her hands folded, certain she'd won. I set down my paper plate and I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. That's the first thing I want you to know, because it's the thing that mattered most. 40 people were braced for a scene, and I gave them quiet instead. And quiet in a loud room is the loudest thing there is. Dad, I said, you're right that you gave me $40,000. Let's talk about that. But first, let's talk about the funeral, since Vanessa keeps bringing it up. I reached into my coat and took out a single sheet of paper, and I unfolded it slowly and I laid it flat on the white tablecloth right beside the wedding cake. It was a printed timeline. Plain dates. This is the day my husband and my daughter were buried, I said, and I pointed. And this, I moved my finger an inch, is the date on the beach photo Mom posted. 1 day later. Lee's, cocktails, making memories, the caption said. I looked up. You didn't miss the funeral for family. You skipped a child's funeral for a vacation. And then you flew home and asked the grieving mother for $40,000. The room had gone very still. My father's mouth opened and shut. My mother's certainty was draining out of her face like water out of a sink. And then Wade did what loud people always do when the quiet person won't flinch. He exploded. He came up out of his chair red-faced, shouting that I was twisting everything, that the dealership was failing, that I owed this family, that I was selfish, alone, bitter, all of it, the whole script at top volume in a church hall. I let him finish. When he ran out of breath, I reached into my coat one more time and I took out the second page, the certified copy, and I set it down next to the timeline and I slid it across the cloth toward my father. You both signed this, I said, 4 years ago at your kitchen table. It's the gift letter the bank required. It states in your own signatures that the $40,000 was a gift, no repayment expected, not a loan in any form. I let that sit. So a demand to pay it back as a debt doesn't hold up. You can ask me for money. You can't bill me for a gift you swore wasn't one. Then I said the 3 things I'd come to say, and I said them gently because they didn't need any force behind them. To Vanessa, you taught me which events are worth attending. I'll remember that the rest of my life. To my mother, who'd gone white, you told me we can't make more family. You were right. So I've stopped trying to make one out of you. And to Wade, still standing there, fists open now. You asked what I even needed it for. I needed it to bury my daughter. You needed Hawaii. Nobody spoke. Then a chair scraped at the back of the hall, and Paige stood up and said, clear as a bell, I was at that funeral. Everything she just said is true. I have the dates. After Paige, the room turned the way a heavy truck turns, slow and then all at once. An aunt I'd barely spoken to in years reached over and quietly slid the gift letter so more people could read it. Folks who'd walked in ready to judge the cold, ungrateful daughter were now staring at a timeline and 2 signatures and a beach photo and doing the only honest thing left to do, looking ashamed of what they'd believed. My mother said my name once. Caroline. Like a question. Like she still thought there was a version of this where I sat back down and we cut the cake. There wasn't. And Wade, my brother, the loud one, ran all the way out of steam and just stood there. For 1 second, I saw it, the real thing underneath all that entitlement. He was terrified. He was going to lose the dealership and maybe the house, and his kids would feel it, and he'd gambled the whole family on bullying me into covering it, and now the whole family was looking at him instead. Callie, he said, quiet for the first time, I'm scared. And I believed him. That was the closest thing to honest any of them had offered me in 11 months. I felt the old reflex twitch, the one that's been packing his lunches since he was a baby. But he still hadn't said he was sorry about Ruby. Not once. Not her name, not that day, not the empty pew. Scared for himself, never sorry for me. So I picked up my 2 pages, folded them back into my coat, and said the truest thing I had left. I hope you figure it out, Wade. I really do. But you're going to have to figure it out without me. Then I walked out into the parking lot, and the air was clean and cold, and I could breathe. The story that I owed them $40,000 died in that hall and never came back. They could have asked me for help the way anybody can ask anybody. What they couldn't do, once their own signatures were sitting out on that tablecloth, was keep calling it a debt I'd walked out on. You cannot collect on a gift the giver swore was a gift. And the relatives who'd been ready to chip in for Wade's repayment quietly closed their checkbooks once they'd seen the dates. The dealership folded that fall. I heard about it the way I hear about all of them now, secondhand from Paige, with no feeling in my chest one way or the other. I went no contact with my parents and my brother, not with a dramatic letter, not with a blow-up. I just stopped picking up, and after a while, they stopped calling, and the quiet that came in behind them was the most peaceful thing I'd felt in years. I kept the people who showed up. Walt comes for Sunday dinner and sits in Eli's chair, and I've made my peace with that, because somebody good should be sitting there. Paige and I talk every week. Diane is semi-retired now, but she still answers when I call with a freight question. Brennan and daughter runs 5 trucks these days, all of them deep green. All of them with 3 lumpy crayon trucks painted small on the doors, where you'd only notice if you looked. People do notice. Drivers ask about it at the truck stops, and I get to say her name out loud. Ruby, my daughter. She drew that. Her name gets to live on the side of a truck rolling down every interstate Eli and I ever ran. I move the little yellow boots. Finally. Not far, just up onto a shelf where I can see them and still get out the door at 4. And on a Sunday this spring, almost a year out, I drove back to the lake at dawn with a fistful of wild daisies, the flat silver water, no wind. And I left them on the bank for the 2 people who actually built me. The water didn't break me that time either. It just held still, the way it does, and held me along with it. I don't reach for my phone out there anymore. There's nobody on it I'm waiting to hear from. I've got the people who came when there was nothing in it for them, and I let go of the ones who only turned up when there was. That's the whole trick, it turns out. That's the entire thing. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up when there's nothing left to gain, and the ones who walk away the very moment there is. That's my story. A funeral they called trivial, a vacation they couldn't cancel, and 1 page they signed and forgot. If someone in your life keeps asking you to carry them while they skip your hardest days, let this be your sign to set the page down. You don't owe a debt you never signed for. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments who actually showed up for you, and hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.